All right, here we are for another lecture. And today's lecture is on consciousness, sleep, dreams, and drugs, and also hypnosis. A lot of topics in this lecture, but it's really very interesting. So, we've already talked about the body's stress response, we've already talked about the nerves, the nervous system, and we've already talked about sensation and perception. Now we're getting into the level of awareness. How is our mind working? What are our states of consciousness? And so that's what this is about today. And I want to just start by sort of having a little moment of rhapsody and wonder at the whole idea of consciousness. Nobody's really super sure what it is. And there are many, many attempts to study it and many theories about what it could be. But the truth is, it's one of the mysteries of life. What is consciousness? We can't be sure. But I wanted to share with you this short quote by one of my heroes, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. He was my professor, and he studied the quality of life. He was one of the founders of positive psychology. He sort of invented or discovered or named this quality of attention called flow, which we talked a little bit about when we studied stress. But he also thought deeply about what makes life worth living. He was a child during World War II when people were being interned in concentration camps. He was a child when the world went upside down and horrors started to happen. And one of the things that he was left wondering was, what do we children do when it seems like the parents have lost their way? What can science tell us about how we should be living our lives? So that's what he dedicated his life to. But he has this quote where he says, control of consciousness determines the quality of life. So this is consistent with some of what we read about when we read about mindfulness as well. It's this idea that if you can turn your attention in the direction of your choosing, that's how you will make a difference in the quality of the life that you live. So that's Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. So what is consciousness? It's essentially our awareness of ourselves and our environment. So here's a picture of the the mountain range near where we live, right up the hill for many of us. And it's this idea that all around us is this world, and all within us is this world, and our consciousness is aware of all of these things. With selective attention, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what it is. And before we go on from this slide, I want to let you know that selective attention is the process of focusing awareness onto a specific stimuli while filtering out other stimuli that may be happening. So if you're listening to the radio, you may have trouble listening to somebody else talking, or even noticing that anything is happening if you're really intense focusing on one stimuli. So you basically are selecting where you're putting your attention. Now here's a video about some young people tossing a ball back and forth. The video asks you to count how many times the ball is tossed back and forth. It's actually really interesting, and I'm going to encourage you to stop now. Stop this video and watch that video. Download the slides if you have to, but watch this video because what I'm going to I don't want to ruin it for you. Okay. So, I'm guessing that you watched the video, and I'm guessing that you counted the ball going back and forth. I forgot how many. I think it was 18 times. Usually there's somebody in the class when I show this video who's like, they're like so proud of themselves that they got the right amount of times that the ball got passed back and forth. And then they feel so foolish because they didn't notice the gorilla walking by. And then when you stop and you look at it again, sure enough, there's a gorilla walking by. The first time I watched this video, I didn't notice it at all. So it always gives me a chuckle when I show this to people because this is exactly what selective attention is. We're focusing on the ball, and then that leads to inattentional blindness. It's the failure to notice things that are outside of our selective attention. So that's pretty cool. You never know when a gorilla is going to go walking by. So when we talk about awareness, we basically talk about of a few levels of awareness, and we tend to break it down into these 4 levels of awareness. First of all, in the sort of light of day, there's the controlled processes. So a controlled process requires maximum attention. So I guess I'm touching the front of the brain because remember how we learned about the forebrain is where your executive function goes. It's where you're very focused, concentrated on it. But an example, the picture that I'm showing you here is of a young boy learning to roll. It's essentially naan or Indian bread. And I picked this picture because my husband is Indian, and we married not too long ago, and I've had to learn to roll this type of bread. And it takes all my attention. It maybe not so much anymore, but when I was first learning it took all my attention. Just, I couldn't think about anything else while I was doing it. But now the next level of awareness is automatic processes. And here I have a picture of an old lady kneading bread. And I'm a little bit of an old lady and I've made a lot of bread in my life. So when you've made a lot of bread and you know how to do it and it's the same old thing, you can do this activity and not even have to focus on it. You can have your mind on other things. You know you have to do it for 10 minutes, and so you just keep kneading the bread. That's the kind of automatic process. Or I have some other examples like walking to class while talking on a cell phone. You've talked on a cell phone, you've walked, you can combine them. They're both relatively automatic processes. Another level of consciousness is the subconscious. These are things that are below your conscious awareness. They're not, you can't necessarily access them. You don't know that they're there. It could be subliminal perception in advertising, or sleeping, or dreaming. This is subconscious, or it could be simply like there are studies that will show faces in a split second, and what they'll find later is that when they show some of these faces later, people will rate the ones that they saw for just a split tiny little second. They'll rate them higher. They'll rate them as more likable. This is an example of processes that are going on. They don't consciously remember the face that they were shown for a split second, but their preference indicates that something registered about that face into their brain system, and it's a sort of subconscious effect. And then lastly, there's non-conscious, or this would be the biologically based lowest level of awareness. Also, there's the unconscious mind, which is a theoretical construct that Freud presented. There's the idea that, so like if you're in a coma, whatever your mind is doing, we have no idea what that is. And we're assuming that it's non-conscious. There's also the unconscious that Freud thought of, which is as another thing. It's this idea that there's sort of like a like a like a like a dark old-fashioned chest with a big lock on it, and it's where you put your unacceptable desires and fears into Freud's idea of your unconscious. That's where you put things you don't want to remember, or you don't want to think about, or you don't want to admit that you think about. Okay. Another thing that's sort of that's nice to think about, again, with the biology of our bodies and how important that is this concept of circadian rhythms. Circadian rhythms are essentially your biological clock, and it's on roughly a 24-hour schedule. There have been people that have looked at the exact timing, but for our purposes, we just want to think about it being a roughly 24-hour cycle. And what happens is, based on this biological clock, your body has ups and downs of hormones being released. For example, the hormone cortisol is released at a certain rate throughout the day. That has an impact on your body temperature that changes throughout the day. And then it also has an impact on your alertness. So here we see a chart of the body temperature changes and how it drops at midnight, as you fall asleep, and how it stays low as you fall asleep, and it sort of inches back up, comes up comes up a little bit, looks like 10 o'clock, stays up, and then falls. And that's roughly the same type of um, pattern that you see in the alertness. So you become more and more alert after you wake up. It peaks at around, I don't know, 4 or 5, and then starts to fall. There are processes in the body that are related to this. The hypothalamus in the brain is important here, and that's where where the hormone melatonin is released. Melatonin is a natural substance in the brain that is very important to inducing sleep. That's why you can buy it over the counter at your local drugstore. And you can take melatonin, and some people say that that is a useful sleep aid. Me, I don't take it because I don't want to take things that mess with my brain chemicals. But that's just me. I found this interesting article about depressive symptoms across the day because there's really interesting uh, uh, research and findings about how depressed people may may have different types of circadian rhythms. And so, without going into it in major detail, I have a lot of the details here on the slide that you can look at when you download it. But they asked people to rate their experience along these 5 variables: negative affect, positive affect, self esteem, suicidality, and tiredness, 10 times a day for 6 days. And these charts show how the depressed group, signified here by this solid line, versus the healthy controls who had no mental health illness, signified here by the dotted line, it shows how they're different. And one of the biggest findings is that those who were depressed had a lot more variability in everything but tiredness. So their negative affect was they had more negative affect, and it was more variable. They had less positive affect, which is positive emotionality, and it went more up and down. Their self-esteem was lower, and it went up and down. You see how the healthy controls had a basic steady state. They had higher incidence of suicidal thinking, and it went up and down throughout the day. And their tiredness actually didn't differ significantly. So most of these thinking aspects of um, of what might change throughout the day are those are different in depressed people. But the more somatic, this more body oriented one, just feeling tired, wasn't that different. Even though they did say they were more tired than the controls, the pattern was relatively the same. And here's a link to that if you want to read it more about it. Another interesting thing about the circadian clock is that you can reset it. So I loved this research about the workers who have to work the night shift. And if you expose them to a bright light right before their shift, then their performance, alertness, and job satisfaction increases. I went up and I looked a little bit more at this, and I found another study where nurses who had been exposed to bright light before their shift and then asked to wear sunglasses on their way home in the morning to sort of reduce the light that was coming in, they showed an improvement in sleep and decreased anxiety and depression when compared to controls. And there's a link to that research. This circadian preference, this is the idea that there are some night owls and there are morning people. I don't know which I'm going to guess if you're anywhere close to being an adolescent, you're a night owl, because we'll talk later about how that's, a function of adolescence, is it sort of shifts you to becoming more of a night owl. As an old person, I'm a bit of a morning person, and maybe I always have been. That just means I feel more creative, more effective in the morning when I first wake up. Night owls, they can't get going until later, and they feel more creative and effective later. But I found this interesting article that found that what's the difference between night owls and morning people? Well, night owls, they make slightly more money. They score higher on intelligence tests. They sleep around more. That means they have sex with more partners. Even though night owls and morning people had just as much sex, night owls slept with more people. Their performance was more influenced by the time of day. That means that at night they did much better, and in the morning they did much worse, whereas the effect of the time of day wasn't as strong on morning people. And they tend to drink and smoke more, basically to have riskier behavior. The morning people were more agreeable, more conscientious, more proactive. They procrastinated less, and they were generally in a better mood. Interesting, huh? So there's pros and cons to both. Now let's talk about sleep. This state, here are these stages of sleep. Sleep has been talked about as a roller coaster. You start and you go down into the depth of sleep, and then you come back up through these other stages of less deep sleep. You hit REM sleep and you go down again. Maybe I should show you here. So you're basically going through these stages of sleep. This shows you that the sleep that you go through the most is N2, the NREM stage 2 sleep. This is where there's lots of spikes and spindles going on. And it goes up to REM sleep and down to deep sleep and up again and down to deep sleep. But you see that the deep sleep lasts longer at the first part of the night. And toward the end of the night, you're not even going that far down into the deep sleep anymore. You're actually going from N2 to REM to N2 to REM to N2 to REM. And you can see here also that your REM sleep tends to last longer toward the end of the night. And what's happening here is that at each one of these stages, how do we know that they're different stages? Because your brain acts differently. The brain waves are different. So when you're awake, your brain waves kind of look like this jiggity jaggedy thing. And what's interesting to me is that when you're during REM sleep, this is your rapid eye movement, your brain waves are actually fairly similar to your waking brain waves. Isn't that kind of cool? And this could be because you're dreaming. This is where they understand the dreaming to take place. But then if you look at these delta waves compared to these theta waves, the theta waves are happening little tiny little short little scratches. And that's in stage 1. Well, whoa, when you go deep down into these delta waves in the stage 3 deep sleep, they're like deep and long kinds of waves. And I think that's just super cool. Rapid eye movement sleep, we've talked about. This is where your eyes are moving and your breathing is irregular. You have high frequency brain waves. Your muscles are paralyzed, and you're usually dreaming during this. As we said, the brain waves are similar to when you're alert. And there is a disorder associated with REM when your paralysis shuts down. That's REM behavior disorder. That means that you start acting out your dreams. It's actually very dangerous. I heard a comedian talk about how he jumped out the second floor of a La Quinta hotel because he has this disorder, but it can be treated with drugs. The REM rebound is a phenomenon that says if you deprive someone of REM sleep the next night, they're going to have a longer phase of REM sleep, almost as if they're trying to get caught up on it. So this is evidence that even though we don't fully understand what REM sleep is for, it's evidence that it's needed. So there are different theories about why we sleep. I can go through all of these theories, but I'm just going to say that the adaptation protection theory of sleep is this idea that we adapted sleep to conserve our energy and to protect us from predators. Could be. There's the repair restoration theory of sleep, where this is where our body repairs itself. So the body has to do all of this reparation work. So it needs the conscious body, the active body, to just chill out and go dark. There's a growth development theory of sleep, in which there's this idea that your brain is actually now structuring and organizing in ways that 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 help the brain structure that we've already studied form into one that is more serviceable toward the growing body and the changing environment. And then there's the learning memory theory of sleep, which says that maybe it's important for learning this sleep that we have. Now, if you have trouble sleeping, I gathered for you, and I do understand that a lot of college students have trouble sleeping. So my first advice isn't even on this page. My first advice is if you can't sleep, the most important thing to do is stop thinking about sleeping and just accept the fact that. And one of the ways that I do this is I'm a believer in this. Let's look at this 90-minute sleep cycle. I'm a believer that if I get 3 hours of sleep and wake up, I'm going to be just as fresh as if I got 8 hours. Because the most important here is to not interrupt this 90 minutes. If you interrupt the 90 minutes in the middle, you're going to wake up groggy and not like it. So I don't even use an alarm clock, even on important days. I just tell myself the time that I want to wake up. And even if I can't sleep the night before, I don't sweat it. I just tell myself, it's okay if I get 3 hours. I'll be all right. I'll get caught up some point. And it tends to work. Usually I go to sleep well before and get much more than 3 hours. But some of these natural sleep aids are interesting. I kind of like this one. Schedule your worrying. So if you're flying a bed worrying, maybe you just have to schedule your worrying for like 6:30 instead of 9:30. Like actually stop, think about your life, make some plans, that might be useful. Another one is progressive muscle relaxation. This is something my husband likes to do, where he'll focus and tense one part of his toes first, and then his feet, and then his calves, and then he'll let them relax. Deep breathing, we've talked about that as well. And these pre-sleep rituals are nice as well. For example, do the same thing every night. Another one is don't do things in your bed that aren't sleep unless there's something better than sleep. But don't use it for work. Don't use it for your computer. Maybe don't even read the news. Use your bed for sleep so that your bed signals. It's its own cue that when you get in it, you get sleepy. Now, dreams are a very favorite topic of most of my students, and we're going to say a little bit about them. There are different theories for why we dream. Freud said that dreams were an outlet for our unacceptable desires. I don't know if I believe that. Yeah, sure, why not? But that can't explain all of our dreams, in my opinion. There's the activation synthesis theory. In this theory, they think that the brain is just sort of doing its reparations or, spontaneous stimulation of brain cells, and that another part of our brain is synthesizing these stimulations and making some sort of sense, making it seem like these firing neurons are telling us a story. possible. Don't know. There's the idea that it's an extension of waking lives, of our waking life, so that our brain is actually processing the experiences that we had or that we think we're going to have, and they help us to organize and interpret our everyday experiences. And then there's a threat simulation that maybe we're rehearsing the types of that. This makes sense for nightmares, right? Like, why are you afraid of bugs? Because you're going to see bugs in your life. You need to sort of rehearse the ability for what you're going to do if the grizzly bear attacks. So here's some interesting dream facts that I found for you. First of all, in REM sleep, the frontal lobe, remember how we learned that that was the executive function spot for planning and all and evaluating and all sorts of things? The frontal lobe is inactive during REM sleep. I thought that was cool. Also, men's dreams tend to involve more action and aggression, and women's dreams tend to involve more conversation and social rejection. Anxiety dreams are more common than happy dreams, but maybe you already knew that because you're human. And all over the world, people tend to dream about the similar things. For example, being chased or falling or feeling frozen and unable to move or being late for something or being naked or flying. That's the I hear that that's the gold standard of dreams. That to dream that you're flying is the most amazing thing. And the truth is, maybe I'm broken, maybe I'm unevolved, I don't know, but I just have never dreamt that I was flying. I did dream that I was breathing underwater, and boy, I loved that because of the anxiety, the buildup, the buildup. Oh no, I'm underwater. And then go ahead, take a breath, and then I'm safe. It was a really lovely dream. So we'll talk a little bit about hypnosis. Hypnosis, I've got this video for you to watch, and I encourage you to watch it. I think I'm making it into an extra credit, um, just to watch it and tell me what you think. But it tells, I like it because it's a nice overview of hypnosis. But what is hypnosis? It's essentially a highly focused attention. You're tuning out other stimuli. There's deep relaxation. Your imagination is increased. Your hallucinations become more likely. And it's a very passive and receptive attitude. That's essentially what hypnosis is. So, how do you hypnotize somebody? First, you got to build trust because you can't hypnotize somebody who doesn't trust you. They got to put their anxiety alert self on hold. Then you want to focus their attention. Then you want to work with deeper and deeper relaxation. You want to emphasize that you're comfortable and you can choose more comfort and let go. And as you do this, you make incremental commands. First, simple things like sit down with your feet on the floor. You start with commands that they can do, that they're glad to do. And over time, you just sort of build the suggestions so that they're more complex. Here's a little link to somebody explaining to you how he hypnotizes people. And what are the effects of hypnosis? One, you can have a decreased responsiveness to pain. You can be suggested that you don't feel pain, and you can have a heightened suggestibility, and that can include telling you what to remember and what to forget. You can have an age regression where you can seem to go back in time and be the younger version of you, but it's largely believed that this is your imagined, it's not actually the younger version of you, but it's your imagination about the younger version of you. And there can be changes in perception. In the book they say, like, oh, take a bite of this apple and it's really an onion, but you can believe that it tastes like you can imagine that it tastes like an apple, and that can become more real to you. This would be an example of perception overriding sensation. And so this is so effective they can use it for medical procedures and health behaviors such as smoking and weight loss. So that's pretty cool. And I wanted to give you this link. It's this link here for how you can try to involve yourself in self-hypnosis. There's like 13 different ideas for how to do self-hypnosis. And I wanted to give it to you because my son used self-hypnosis when he was going through some pretty intense anxiety in high school. And I think it was something like, I think his gesture was something like this, and it calmed him right down. And so it worked for him. So I wanted to just suggest, maybe if you need some instant relaxation technique, this approach could possibly help you. Now, oh, I forgot to put in, oh, this is in the wrong order. The next thing we're going to talk about, and last thing we're going to talk about, is drugs. Keywords. Addiction is when you have a compulsive desire to use the drug. Tolerance is when you use the drug so much it stops having an effect on you. That can lead to dependence, which can either be physical or psychological. That means that if you don't take this drug, you're going to suffer. You might suffer emotional pain. You might actually suffer physical pain, like the shakes or throwing up or vomiting. And these shakes or throwing up or vomiting, those would be considered withdrawal symptoms. They're a sign that you're dependent on the drug. Oops, another typo. And there are 4 categories of psychoactive drugs that I just want you to know. The book is really interesting. Think you're going to enjoy reading about all of these drugs. I'm not going into them in detail right now because the book kind of really does a good job of it. I just want to highlight to you that there are these 4 categories of psychoactive drugs. That means they affect our mind. There are depressants or sedatives that decrease our body processes and our responsiveness. Stimulants that increase our responsiveness and our processes. There are opiates or narcotics that numb our senses and relieve pain. And there are hallucinogens that produce perceptual distortions. And so as you're reading about it, I do think you should know what common category of drug are these common substances. So alcohol, depressant. Nicotine, stimulant. Caffeine, easy, stimulant. Marijuana, hallucinogen. Amphetamine, stimulant. Ecstasy, stimulant. Morphine, opiate. So you'll be reading about this, and I think you'll enjoy it. I find this book does a great job talking